Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and thank you even more for staying on for this sort of graveyard slot in your two-day conference. I think it's the Rob Stroud from HEPI was saying before, he thought this was his third independent HE conference he'd spoken at. I think it's my fourth, so I think I beat him. And it's always a great pleasure, and it's a great testament actually to the work Alex and the team, I think, have been doing, because every year it gets a bit bigger and better and closer to the policymakers and the power brokers. So thank you for inviting me. Now, for those of you who don't know what HEPI is, and many of you will, we're the UK's only higher education specialist think tank. We're supported by, it's going up all the time, but it's about 115 higher education institutions up and down the UK. And we work with a small number of corporate organisations as well, so one or two of whom have stalls outside, such as Ellucian, for example. And you heard a minute ago from David Laws, who heads up HEPI. We're HEPI. They slightly plagiarised our name. We remember our H's at HEPI, but they forget it. But anyway, we're probably most well known for our events programme. We did a big launch last week of the David Willetts book, A University Education, about his time as Minister, and lots of other things as well in the Shard. We had a dinner last night with Anthony Selden, Vice-Chancellor of Buckingham University, who's written recently for us about mindfulness and how to stave off mental health problems. And we're perhaps, we have a blog as well, and we're perhaps most well known for our publications. I haven't got time to go into those because I was asked to talk for about 20 minutes and make sure there's time for questions. There is, I don't expect you to be able to read that, but that is a selection. It's not even the entirety of the publications we've put out this year. You may be most interested in one in the top left-hand corner, Alternative Providers of Higher Education, Issues for Policymakers. We were looking, it was published in January, and we were looking at what the bill, as it then was, meant for alternative providers. But there's lots of others relevant to you as well. I mean, there's one in the middle down the bottom about widened participation, which includes a chapter from an alternative provider. There's one on the TEF there, and as I say, one on mindfulness by Anthony Selden. So there's a brief run-through of what we do. And do come, if you're around in London next week, do come. Oh, sorry, I did these slides. Ah, there we are. Do come, if you can, to our lecture next week. Our big annual lecture is one of our biggest events of the year, and we always have an international flavour, and we're flying in the President of the National University of Singapore, who's going to tell us about the rise of Asia in educational terms and what that means. So always followed by a very nice Prosecco reception. When I took over HEPI, it was always, I'm afraid it was a champagne reception, but we've downgraded it because we are a charity. So, but it's very good Prosecco nonetheless. So anyway, I want to start with something that is often forgotten, which is actually talking about the status of our traditional universities, and I take Paul Kirkham's point, and we'll come on to talking about the broader range of HEIs in a moment. But I want to start by reminding people, because it's surprisingly often forgotten, that all our universities in the UK are private and independent and autonomous. And we do not have a single, we don't have public universities. And this means, of course, that in some respects, and we were hearing this a bit before from the DFE, in one of the breakout sessions, in some respects, HEFI-funded universities have been a bit less different than people often perceive to the institutions in this room. And I'm a massive fan of autonomy and independence for your members and you UK members, and because I think autonomy and independence breeds excellence. I think it's no accident that we have both the best universities in Europe, according to every single global league table, and we also have the most autonomous universities in Europe, according to the European Universities Association. And there's no other country in the world that has quite so many world-class universities that is of a comparable size to the UK. And it only takes a glance. We often look at other countries' HE systems to see what lessons there are for us. And it only takes a glance at other countries to see, to remind ourselves of that autonomy and independence. In some European countries, academics are civil servants. Every new course has to be cleared by the Department for Education. Universities are expected to enroll every student that passes whatever the national school leaving certificate is. These have consequences, you know, if you're, I mean, good and bad. If every academic's a civil servant, you have no arguments about Vice-Chancellor's pay because, you know, they're fixed in the civil service pay rates. If you have to enroll every student who passes the school leaving certificate who wants to come to your institution, that has a big effect on dropout rates because everybody enrolls and then lots of people drop out in the weeks early in year. And so to British eyes, running a university in other countries can look and feel like running just a big school. Whereas here you have, control over admissions and who you recruit and what courses you run. And the fact that we have no public universities, in a second I am going to come on to the more usual institutions within independent HE membership. But I think it's important to start on this point about autonomy and independence and how deeply embedded it is in the UK HE sector, because it's poorly understood, including sometimes by people who work in those very universities, who think they work in the public sector. They don't. At best, they work in the charity sector. It also is sometimes helpful for them because it allows them to blame government when things go wrong. And I remember being sometimes on the receiving end of that. If your department's about to be closed down, you can blame government, even though actually it's not government's decision. When I worked in Whitehall, we were on the other side of the coin. We were routinely accused of wanting to control universities, and the absence of any effective examples to show we were trying to control universities didn't seem to stop the critics. But in reality, we actually tried, whether we succeeded or not, to think about university autonomy in pretty much all the decisions that we made. And in fact, probably the single biggest reason why, when I was working for David Willetts, we were so in favour of diversity and new providers was to provide a competitive pressure to the traditional sector, because we didn't have any direct levers over them. And if you can't reform institutions directly because autonomy is untouchable, you can still shape what they do by facilitating competition. And before I say more about that, I will just say one thing, which I am a bit, despite everything I've said, a tiny bit worried about how the Office for Students is taking life, because it seems to me that despite all those debates in the House of Lords during the passage of the bill, when the government promised that autonomy would not be disrupted, it seems to me the government is now passing every single difficult issue that lands on Joe Johnson's desk over to the Office for Students, and they've got a bulging in tray. This slide's just really to remind me to say this. They've got a bulging, if it's grade inflation, if it's free speech, if it's Vice-Chancellor's pay. Now, these are important issues, but I'm not totally convinced they should be at the absolute top of the in tray of the incoming Office for Students. I think autonomy and quality and some of the things Les was just talking about should be there before those other issues. So I think you'll be hard-pressed to find a more fervent advocate of university autonomy than I am. And in recent weeks, I've had to go on Newsnight to defend free speech in universities, and I've had to be on the Today programme defending universities' rights to set their own staffing terms and conditions, which are sticky wickets, believe you me. But I was happy to do so because I think, as I say, the whole strength of the sector is built on autonomy and independence. But we have to recognise, I think, that there are downsides from that. One is probably uniformity, where incumbents opt to behave like each other and to shut out sometimes new entrants. Remember, this was a chart from our event last week with David Willetts about his new book, which I found very illuminating. He was trying to, there we go, this chart shows the number of new universities in European countries between 1300 and 1790. And you'll see Italy, France, Spain, Scotland, Germany didn't exist as a single country then, massively grew. England just had Oxford and Cambridge the whole way through. So it shows that shutting out new providers is not an old thing. It's not a new thing. It's been going on for hundreds of years in the UK. And it does breed, I think, uniformity. It can breed excessive hierarchy. And we talked about that in a recent HEPI paper written for us by Tim Blackman, Vice-Chancellor of Middlesex University, who said, let's just think for a minute. And imagine if instead of having a UK HE system like this with Oxford and Cambridge in the top and somewhere like Middlesex a lot further down, let's have one like this. Like they do in other countries. Every university is much more similar. I don't particularly agree with that, but I think it's a very interesting thought experiment about what it would mean for the sector. And the third thing that autonomy can sometimes breed is it hinders policymakers from being able to deliver the skills the economy needs, because it's not up to the policymakers what courses are delivered and what skills people get. So I think tackling those challenges, too much uniformity, too much hierarchy, too much perhaps insufficient focus on the needs of the economy, is where you, in my opinion, come in. And the best way, of course, to tackle those problems is not to have less autonomy for people in the system. It's to go on encouraging new providers who deliver things in new and different ways. In recent times, I mean, I've argued in the past in HEPI publications that in recent times before the bill, running an alternative provider sometimes felt like you're in the world's longest obstacle course with ever-changing rules and no finishing line in sight, because the rules kept changing and you never knew where you were, and investors weren't prepared to make decisions on those bases. And we've written about this. Roxanne, who's in the room, has written about it for us. Carl Ligo, who's here today, has written about it for us. Matthew Batstone, who was here earlier from New College of the Humanities. They've all written for HEPI about how difficult it has been to get successful new providers off the ground. And of course, the bill, I think, the act, I should say now, does make life easier. Now, there's probably not anything up to this point in my speech that Joe Johnson would disagree with. There's probably not anything that Viscount Younger would disagree with. I saw his speech, what he said to you this morning. But they probably will disagree with what I'm about to say, which is I don't think the Higher Education and Research Act resolves all the challenges. And one oddity of the debates on the bill in Parliament was the typology, if you like, the different types of providers that we're going to have in future. They weren't really discussed. You know, there were really fierce debates in the House of Lords on whether we have a definition of what a university is in legislation, on whether university autonomy was going to be protected, on exactly what UKRI's research responsibilities were going to be. There wasn't much debate, you know, about the different types of provider. And we've heard about some of them today. I've only been here this afternoon, but we've heard about some of them. You know as well as I do, there are three main types. Registered providers, there's the approved providers, and there's then these approved fee cap providers, and I won't go into the details of all of them, but many of you will know them as well as I do. But the traditional universities, by and large, are in category 3, and some APs may join them. Approved providers are the ones that have no fee cap but can charge £6,000. Sorry, they're £6,000 loans, no research money either. And the registered providers, where we're all waiting to find out if that means anything much at all. There's only a registration fee of only £1,000. And by the way, when dodgy-sounding higher education providers email me and say, can we be in the HEPI University Partnership Programme, which costs £2,000 a year, I always email them back and say, great, can I come and visit? And if they're reputable, they like me to go and visit. If they're dodgy, they never reply to my email, it seems to me. But you can, it seems to me there are people who approach me because they want to put the HEPI logo on their website, and it would cost them £2,000 a year to register, to be in the basic registered thing, £1,000 a year. You know, it seems to me an odd system. And in fact, I think there's 4 problems with the new system. So this is what the government says it's going to look like. Those are the categories: approved, fee cap, approved, and registered. And it seems to me there's 4 problems with this. First, the new system replicates many of the features of the current system. Actually, approved, fee cap, approved, and registered, they're pretty similar to what we've already got. And that is, and one of the oddities, I think, is that if you're in the approved category, you're not allowed any research funding at all, even if you're a not-for-profit, even if your research is better quality. And the money HEFCI distributes, and in future UKRI distributes for research, is called quality-related funding. How can you be, so if you're delivering the best quality research in the country, you're still not entitled to the funding quality. And I think this is something we need to have a debate about, especially now that the teaching functions of universities sit with the OFS, and the research funding functions sit somewhere else. In the old days, when those functions all sat in HEFCI, maybe there was an argument for it. I don't see how there is in the new world. Secondly, if you look at the impact assessment on the bill, which then became an act, you'll find actually the biggest category is not any of the 3 I've already discussed. The biggest category is one the government never, ever, ever talks about. And it's the 553 providers that the government thinks will be entirely outside the OFS registration system. And when we did that paper back in January talking about the future of alternative providers, the journalists rang up the DFE press office and said, What do you think of this HEPI figure, that there'll be over 500 alternative providers, or whatever you want to call them, higher education providers of some sort, entirely outside the OFS system? And the DFE press office said it's a nonsense figure that HEPI's just made up and to try and win some headlines. And the journalist rang me back and said this, and I said, well, it's not. It's in the impact assessment of the bill produced by the department. So these are the government's own figures. And the interesting thing is, if you then think about how many providers are going to be quite well or quite tightly regulated, so in the approved categories, and how many are going to be in the basic category and the entirely unregulated category. Well, there's a hell of a lot more in the lightly and completely unregulated category than there are in the approved one. So I'm sort of not saying you don't have to agree with all the points I'm making, just to say just to think this is a little bit different to the way the government talks about their own legislation as sorting out higher education for a generation or more. It seems to me that it's not all that much logic to it, particularly when the basic category is so vague. So if there's a scandal in one of those providers in the basic category that, remember, has the OFS logo on their website, what is the reputational risk for those of you who are in the approved category? You know, and I'm just wondering, I don't think these issues have been fully thought through, even though the bill, when it was going through Parliament, had more amendments in the House of Lords than any piece of legislation has ever had in the House of Lords ever, as far as records kept. And then I think there's the fourth issue is, what about those of you who choose to be in the approved fee cap category? And I was listening very carefully to the DFE official in the breakout session earlier who was talking about this. But the department still talk as if that grey slug of institutions in the approved fee cap category are alternative providers. But how are they alternative? They're regulated in exactly the same way as Oxbridge, exactly the same way as the Red Bricks, exactly the same way as the plate glass universities founded in the 60s, exactly the same way as the former polytechnics, and exactly the same way as all the new universities that came into existence when we lowered the student numbers threshold for university title from 4,000 to 1,000 when I was in government. So in what sense are they alternative providers? But the department is still thinking of them as alternative providers. So I don't think this is a system that's been fully thought through, in my opinion. And I suspect, even though Brexit is clearly the #1 priority for the next couple of years, and even though the government doesn't have a simple majority in the House of Lords, I suspect that whether we like it or not, the Higher Education Act of 2017 is unlikely to be the only bit of important higher education legislation between now and over the next decade or so. Choose your time frame. I'll stop there, but this is the sort of thing that I'm worried about. And I've put some of these slides up on our website if you want to sort of spend time looking at them in more detail. And do if you think I've got that wrong and I'm misunderstanding something, do please tell me, because this is what worries me. Thank you.
Do we, well, I had questions for Nick, but I think first off, I would say, I don't recognise those figures. They definitely came from a government source, but it was a government survey in 2014 which had a lot of flaws to it, mostly that it was old. It was only released 3 years later.
Well, the root total number might be from a survey, yeah, but what category each one is going to end up in is not from a survey. That is the government's expectation of what happens in year 1 of the OFS.
But the 550 figure was based on the fact that back in 2014 there was identified 700 or so providers. Just before there was a significant crackdown by the Home Office, and lots of them are closed down. So it'd be interesting to see.
Alex, you mustn't be able to get away with this. You are falling into Home Office language. The Home Office say they have shut down hundreds of bogus colleges. A lot of those colleges, what the Home Office actually mean is those colleges did not apply for Tier 4 licences. They have not all closed down. And you shouldn't let the Home Office get away with using that language.
That's true in 2011. In 2014, there was a lot of compliance action which actually did close down colleges.
So how many would you say there are?
Around 100.
100 alternative providers in total.
Not as total. Sorry.
How many?
No, closed down that year.
Yeah. Okay, so 450, not 550.
I think it's probably around. Well, anyway, it would be great to do some more.
That's a big number,
surveying.
And if things go wrong in those institutions, it threatens the reputable institutions in this room, represented by independent.
I agree with your point. Yeah.
In my opinion.
Any questions? Tim at the front here. Oh, give me a microphone. winding its way through the crowd.
So Tim Stewart, BPP University. I just want to say I really appreciate the point about the grey slab there and the idea that it's alternative and the continuing language of alternative. And I just really wanted to emphasise over the last 2 days, I've heard many speakers use language quite without care. So we've heard endlessly that alternative providers are not universities, and I represent an alternative provider that is a university. We also had today that alternative providers are small. Not all are small. We have 16,000 students, and that all alternative providers are specialists, which may not be the case either. So I do think this is a mindset that is carrying forward into 2018 that we should continue to challenge. Nick gave one example, that there have been several across this conference that I don't recognise necessarily as being the language that's all that helpful, particularly for this lobby body. And the word that we use here is independent, and we've hardly ever heard the word independent over the last couple of days. And I think it's a good word, and I think it's one we should be using more.
Yeah, it's interesting. The independent schools don't call themselves alternative schools. They call themselves independent schools because they latched on a long time ago to the fact that it's a positive word. I mean, we did struggle when I worked in the department to come up with a term. You know, alternative provider, everybody hates. But believe you me, some of the alternatives might have been even worse. But
it's
independent
used in some other sectors as well, in government, isn't it? It's alternative providers are just generally a terminology which is used.
I love my music. I think of alternative music, and that's something so way out of the mainstream, just as Tim says, probably not the right analogy.
I was tempted to go with indie HE, but...
Is there one at the back?
Hi.
Roxanne.
Roxanne again. Two comments. Firstly, as you know, I'm sceptical about that 553. We've talked about it before and who they're made up of. But whoever they are, or 453, whoever they are, they can't have Tier 4 and be taking international students. They can't have degree awarding powers because they'd have to be in one of the other categories. Yeah. They can't be taking any kind of student loans. They can't be taking any sort of research grant. I find it very hard to believe that there are several hundred institutions who don't do any of those things that are still being labelled as HE. But if they are, they must be in a validating relationship with a university, which is, I know that it's not part of what people officially call regulation, but is still being overseen, or the quality is being checked by the university, you know, in the same way that they do different departments. So I get what you're saying in the sense that there's a bunch there that the government's kind of pretending isn't there. But I don't know that I don't know that they should necessarily have to become registered. I don't think there's any, you know, there's no public finance risk, or I mean, and as you say, they're autonomous. Yeah. We're all autonomous institutions. Yeah. So.
Well, I love talking to Roxanne about these issues because I always learn a huge amount when I do. But I would say a couple of things. I mean, I remember when we walked into the business department back in 2010, and I was David Willetts, a special advisor, and we said to our officials, how many non-HEPI funded HE providers are there? And they said, we haven't a clue, and we're not very interested because we don't regulate them. And we said, well, hang on, aren't we the business department? And aren't quite a lot of these organisations businesses? And they said, yeah, okay, Minister, okay. So, and then you'll remember they did the first survey, which took a very long time to do. And what was the figure in the first survey? 600, something like that? And then they did the second survey where they found over 700 alternative providers, some of whom are very small. They don't all have validating arrangements because some of them teach professional qualifications level, 5 and 6. Some of them might teach HNCs, H&Ds. Some of them might teach overseas qualifications, I guess. I don't think we do know as much about them as we probably should. I mean, some people have written this up, of course. But what worries me is the gap between, and by the way, I don't actually, I mean, if these are legal entities, if these are legal companies and they keep to company law, I don't particularly mind them existing either. What worries me, though, are two things. One, the gap between government rhetoric about what their reforms have delivered and the reality, because nobody who listens to the government would think there are as many or more likely or entirely unregulated HE providers than there are regulated ones. No one believes that every time you hear Joe Johnson or Fai-Kan Younger speak. That's the first thing. And the second thing that worries me is if there were, most of them are very small, I'm sure, if there were a scandal there, the reputational risk for all the people in this room. Because the reputational risk, if things go wrong in those 450, let's call it, it's not going to be Oxford that suffers. You know, it's going to be new startups and some of the independent HE members. I would have thought.
Is that still working? Oh, yeah, I guess that could be true. And actually, if you're talking about people who offer things that are not degrees, then, I mean, we did our own scoping exercise, and it was a few years ago, but not that long ago, and we had about 12 or 1,300, so
Yeah.
there's actually potentially more than that. My second point was in relation to the approved category, and I agree, this has puzzled me a lot, why the research funding is linked in here. It seems to me that that's quite different from the teaching funding now. And the only explanation I've been able to come up with is if they didn't do that, if they didn't tie in being approved fee cap with the ability to get research, then any institution that felt that it could charge a lot more than 9,000 could simply go with approved and have their loans at 6 or 7 or whatever they end up being, charged 20 or 30, and so I think it's a manipulation device on the top unis. That's what I think that approved one's about.
I think it very could be a manipulation device, but I'd say two things in response. One is, if that's what people were worried about, you know, people were worried about Oxford moving from approved fee cap to approved and charging £30,000 a year. Well, there is Les and Les's replacement, who, you know, and you could apply something, you know, for really high fees in the approved section to, you know, link to the new Director of Fair Access and Participation. Look, I don't have the perfect answer. I think you're proving my point. My point was we haven't fully thought through these categories properly. And I think actually this discussion is proving that. And of course, the other absurdity about the research is even worse than I said, because the other absurdity about the research is the people in the first column find it easier to have the £9,000 fees because their students can borrow every penny of the £9,000. And of course, they're the ones who then have a nice big cross subsidy from the teaching fee at £9,000 over to research in some instances, not in all instances. And we recently wrote a report about cross subsidies from research to teaching. So I think, if anything, this conversation is convincing me even more that this is the debate we should be having. I remember leaving this conference last year and having a word in the corridor outside with Rachel Hall, who was then a journalist of Research Fortnight and is now a Guardian HE Network. And she said, this is really weird. Why are you an AP if you're in this first category? And I couldn't explain it to her then, and I couldn't explain it to her now, and it's a year later. And the bill's gone through, and it's now an act, and it's got royal assent, and this is the world we're meant to be living in. And I don't think it makes a tremendous amount of sense.
Well, I mean, as far as we're sort of concerned, there won't be APs after OFS takes its position, and you know, I think this is describing.
Well, the government's definition is everybody in approved is an AP. Everybody is an AP. There are no non-APs in approved. AP.
Those who will apply for approved are currently APs. But I think I'll be very disappointed in August 2019 if the government is still talking about alternative providers, and certainly we won't be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I say, these are the government's figures, and according to the government figures, the blue, you know, they're the only ones they actually called HEIs in their impact assessment. All the rest are called for further education colleges, alternative providers, rather. So you may be right, and all these colours blend into some. I don't. What does orange, blue, and grey make? I don't know. You may be right, but I somehow doubt in the political environment we're in that an alternative provider is going to be regarded as exactly the same as a traditional university unless, you know, more power to your elbow. I don't think it will be in the political environment where politics is very fraught at the moment. The centre-right government has no majority in the House of Commons. If a Labour government, you know, vice-chancellors tell me, I think they're wrong, but vice-chancellors tell me Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister by this time next year, after the Brexit negotiations have fallen apart and after another general election, in which case, you know, this slightly uneasy truce represented by these charts, you know, is likely to go in the opposite direction to the direction I'm arguing for. I'm arguing for clarity. I suspect they would want to make life a lot harder for your members.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. I think we'll draw to close there. And
sorry, I should have been more optimistic. Should have been.
Obviously, the rousing closer. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.